Welcome to our Together on Mission podcast, brought to you by the Baptist Union of Victoria and hosted by our Director of Mission and Ministries, Reverend Daniel Bullock. Daniel will be joined by a guest from our Victorian Baptist family each week for a brief discussion that aims to encourage you in your personal walk of faith and give you some practical suggestions that you can implement through your week. Throughout this year, the podcast will be focusing on the theme of being and sharing the good news. For this episode of the podcast, Daniel is joined by Ryan Vallee, Senior Church Relationships Manager at Alpha Australia. Daniel and Ryan will talk today about being and sharing the good news of Jesus, and in particular how Alpha helps us to do that. Let's hear now from Daniel and Ryan.
Well, hello everyone and welcome to this week's podcast. Today I'm going to reflect on being and sharing the good news, on helping people encounter Christ so that they can experience the good news of Jesus' transformational love. To help me reflect on this topic, my guest today is Ryan Vallee. Ryan works for Alpha Australia as a church engagement expert. He's a former pastor at River Life Baptist Church, but a volunteer there in the church there in Queensland. And recently I travelled with Ryan down the west coast of the USA on a leadership tour that focused on our topic of sharing our faith, church planting and leadership. Ryan, welcome to our podcast. Firstly, can you tell our listeners a little about yourself, a little about your family and what your job actually entails?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Dan. It's great to be with everyone today. I'm a Baptist pastor in Queensland, and if you hear an accent, I often say I'm Canadian in public, but the truth is I'm Canadian, American, and I upgraded to Australian as well when I married an Aussie, and I've been in Australia about 14 years. So I've got my wife Rebecca, Beck, and Ambrosia, who we call Bo, and she's 5. And I've been at Kenmore Baptist Church, which became River Life Baptist a number of years ago when we made a building transition. And for me, I came out just for a visit, having studied at Regent College in Vancouver, Canada, with quite a few Aussies. And when I came out here to Australia, ended up sticking around KBC. So been there for about 13 years, 14 years now. But 3 years ago, joined the Alpha team. And my role with Alpha really is working with strategic churches and leaders across Australia, just working out how do we leverage Alpha as a cultural tool in this moment to empower us for evangelism, to move us from a system of maintenance within our church to back onto mission. And for me as a pastor, I found that Alpha was one of those things I didn't really realize what it could do until I started to use it myself. So I was becoming frustrated with the amount of effort we would put into a lot of our corporate strategies of evangelism and wanting to see a space where people could connect into the life of the church. And I wasn't really seeing that. And then I also was finding, not only in our corporate strategies of evangelism, I found most people hadn't really lost the confidence in the gospel, but they lost the confidence on how they might share it effectively with the friends and coworkers and the places they go in everyday life. Okay. And so Alpha became that bridging tool for us, where not only was it connecting with all of our social programs in the community, but also suddenly there was a space where people could invite their friends and family member or even their boss and have a space where, you're watching a video, you share a meal, and you just talk about it. And there's not many places in culture where you can do that. And yet, McCrindle research says that 1 in 4 would come explore questions of faith in life if invited by a friend or family member they trusted. And it's 1 in 2 if you're below the age of 25. And so here's this, this is the greatest cultural moment of evangelism in our generation. And so suddenly we just saw this was empowering our people to have a safe place they could come, explore questions of faith with someone they love, and learning how to do that well. That's what I've been doing the last 3 years, 4 years now. Like, how do we really, really empower our churches and our leaders for best practice to know how do we get the most out of what this tool can offer our churches?
Okay, it sounds like you're very passionate about it, so that's fantastic. We'll come back to you in just a moment after my reflection and pick up on some of the things that you talked about there in particular. So thanks very much. To our listeners through this podcast, I hope your confidence in the gospel and indeed sharing the good news will be renewed and strengthened. There's a great story in 2 Kings chapter 6 and 7 that I think can help us understand our mission mandate a great deal. In that story, King Ben-Hadad of Aramea is besieging the city of Samaria. And as a result, there's this massive famine in the city, and the people inside the city are starving to death. Any available food that they could find was being sold at exorbitant prices, and people were so hungry and so desperate that we're told towards the end of chapter 6 that they were killing and eating their own children. A terrible, terrible situation. As we move into chapter 7, we're introduced to 4 lepers, and their situation is even more diabolical. See, the lepers were outside the city. They couldn't go inside the city because they were lepers. They were considered to be unclean. Even in good times, they would have probably been stoned to death if they went into the city. Mostly, they probably would have survived on mercy and the food scraps of people throwing things over the city walls. Of course, there was no food scraps to be thrown over the wall, and very little mercy because the people were looking after themselves. So their dilemma was, if they went into the city, killed immediately, no doubt about it. If they stayed where they were and the Arameans attacked, then they would be first in line to be killed. And if they went over to the Aramean camp, they'd probably be killed as well. So they're at the crossroads and really in a difficult situation, figuring out what they should do. So they started talking amongst themselves about their options and what they would do. And they basically decided that their best option would be to go over to the Aramean camp and maybe get some scraps, maybe get a bit of mercy from those folks over there. But if they didn't, they would be killed. They'd be no worse off than what they were. And so that was their decision. And so early one morning, they got up and they made their way over to the Aramean campsite. As they were doing so, though, God was at work in the background, as he often is. And what God was doing was putting into the minds, into the ears, and to the hearts of the Arameans fear. They could hear hoofbeats, as if a whole lot of horses were coming towards them, rolling chariots of mighty armies coming their way. And they became frightened. They started to think themselves, maybe the Israelites have signed a treaty with the Egyptians and the Hittites, and this mighty army was coming to Israel's aid, coming to destroy them. And so, filled with fear, they immediately fled the scene and left everything behind, everything they had. They just left and they ran and got out of there as soon as they possibly could, including tables of food, all their wealth and all their riches. Now, unbeknownst to them, the lepers are then now walking into this situation of a deserted campsite. They think the Arameans, so they probably went into there very, very tentatively, very worried, very concerned. But as they get close, they see that nobody is around. And they sneak a look into one of the tents and they see tables full of food and they're starving to death. So they throw caution to the wind and they run into the tent and they start feasting on all the food and they gorge themselves. They eat as much as they possibly can. Then they look around the tent and they find silver and gold and fine clothing and they gather as much as they possibly can and they run out and they go and find a hiding place and they put all the riches in a hiding place. Then they go back into the campsite, into another tent, and they find the same situation. More food, more riches. They're gorging themselves. They're grabbing as much as they possibly can. And then, as they're doing all this, there is this wonderful verse in chapter 7, verse 9, where they say to themselves, listen to what they said. They said to each other, "What we are doing is not right. This day is a day of good news and we are keeping it to ourselves. If we wait until daylight, punishment will overtake us. Let's go at once to the royal palace." So what they do is they run back to the city gates and they call out to the guards and they tell the people the good news. They said, hey, the Arameans have gone. They've deserted. They've fled the scene. There's food for everybody. There's riches to be had. The siege has finished. Come and get some food. Now, the people up there, of course, a little bit suspect. They're not quite sure if these lepers have been used as spies, or if the Arameans have just deserted back a little bit from the tent city, and when the Sumerians come out, or when the Israelites come out, they will start attacking them. So they send out a couple of sort of people to check it out. They go and they check it out, and eventually they come back and say, yep, it is as they said. The Arameans have gone. There's plenty of food for everybody. The gates are open. People storm into the city, and the siege is ended, and everybody is satisfied. It is a fantastic story. It is a great story. But I suggest it's a story that paints a picture of a world in which we live today. We Christians, just like those lepers, have discovered in Jesus a source of food and nourishment that can satisfy our hunger for meaning in the present, hope for our future, and the key to live a full and an abundant life. As Christians, we live with the privilege of grace, having grace in our lives, knowing that the God of the universe loves us, desires a relationship with us, is willing and able to carry our burdens, forgive our sins, and give us strength in the challenges of life. In the church, we have a community where we can come together in different contexts and from different contexts to encourage and build each other up, where we can learn together and support one another. What we have in Jesus and his church is awesome. It is awesome. It is good news. But isn't it sad that you and I are eating so much while the rest of the world is going hungry? What we have in Jesus is good news, and it's wrong for us to keep it to ourselves. The mission of the church is to take it to the world, to go back to the starving, desperate, hurting, lonely people and tell them what we have discovered. And the word we use for this discovery and this task that we have is the word witness. A witness is simply someone who has seen or experienced something and then tells others about it. A witness says, this happened to me and I think it can happen to you. A Christian witness simply tells others of our encounters and our experience of Jesus. It is telling the story of God's transforming grace in our lives, a story our spiritually hungry world desperately needs to hear. But of course, how do we do this? There are many ways, the most effective being through personal relationships, but as Ryan said, confidence is a challenge for us in relation to sharing and the risk of maybe breaking those relationships, hurting those relationships in some way. But one way that has proven effective for many years and that now is inviting people that we are in relationship with to an alpha program or an alpha launch night or something like that, so that they can have a safe place to process the claims of the Christian faith. Now, Ryan, you talked about alpha being a safe place in our introduction there. In what way would you say alpha is a safe place to invite friends? Because people don't want their friends coming into a place where they feel judged or ridiculed, or they feel that their questions are invalid and things like that. So what makes alpha a safe place? Why would we have the confidence to invite somebody to an alpha?
Yeah, thanks. I think one safety concern really as a church leader that we have in mind is honestly a safety that we are really following in what the Holy Spirit is already doing in the lives of the work around us. I love what Daryl Johnson says. He says, we're entering a conversation God is already having with someone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So therefore the pressure on us really isn't quite as much as we might think. We are to be witnesses, as you say. We are to be a part of the Great Commission and to be sharing this good news. But the greatest evangelist, of course, even in the Gospels, is John 4, the woman at the well, who simply says, come and see a man, who's told me everything I've ever done. And the whole town comes out and they come to faith. So like that sense of safety probably begins even with the people that are within our church. Like there's a safety in which we can enter into what the Holy Spirit is already doing in the lives of those around us. There's another sense of safety in which we're going to be expending social capital to invite a neighbor that we're going to have to see every day, a coworker, a boss potentially. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you're thinking about all the different people. Well, we want to be able to create an environment where people can explore and have a great experience without pressure that they're going to be told what to think or how to live their lives. And we got to trust that the Holy Spirit's at work in the process of coming, exploring questions of faith. And what I love about Alpha is globally around the world, you'll see whatever culture you're from, people share meals together. And it's a sense of coming around the table, exploring questions of faith and life, where we can love them, listen to them, hear what they think, because guess what? They're already going to hear what we think as a Christian when they watch the video. And then we get just to be journeying, we get a journey with them through the process over those weeks ahead. So it is a safe place. You come, I love to say, come once when you make an invitation, see if you like it, come with me, we'll go together. And if you have a great time, keep coming back.
Okay, that's. I think that's a reasonable ask. Now, not every church runs Alpha, but
Yeah.
I know you, and some have run it in the past, but don't run it anymore. But I know you're launching an Australian-wide initiative across Baptist churches in the second term next year. Can you just tell us a little bit about it, just fairly briefly, but not too long, but just so that people understand what's coming their way and what maybe they can do about it in their own church?
Yeah, Mission 25 is what we're calling this National Baptist Alignment, where we're encouraging all churches in Term 2 to run Alpha together in their own spaces, whether it's in the workplace or churches or cafes and schools, wherever it might be. And I'd encourage you to consider using the youth series in your youth programs, as well as the adult film series and whatever language you might want to use it as. There's plenty of options. There's a Chinese film series as well, done in Mandarin and Cantonese. So there's plenty of options, whatever, with, I think there's over 80 subtitled languages as well. So there's lots of options there. But the real heart is that we would have an alignment together, launching Alpha together in Term 2. And that if you sign up for Mission 25, there will be a guided process where we will offer training, consultation, and support systems that you can start getting right away. And you can sign up and you'll get all this information. But really, we want to give you the resourcing starting right away. Term 1, there's an idea of we would have a season of prayer. Term 2, run Alpha. Term 3, we'll celebrate the 1 millionth Alpha participant. And it happens to coincide with the Baptist World Congress. So Elijah Brown and a number of us have been working together to see how we're going to celebrate that 1 millionth Alpha participant in Australia at the Baptist World Congress, where we can inspire the 7,000 participants that reach out to about 52, 53 million around the world. That this is what happens when we step into alignment together in prayer, in mission, and Alpha just happens to be a part of the tactic in our missional strategy. And then Term 3 will celebrate together as we do Baptism Week together in partnership with Crossover Australia. Okay. So we're just encouraged that. So that's a kind of a summary vision of what we're trying to go for.
Fantastic, Ryan. And of course, we'll be putting information out about that through our communications channels as well. Now, Ryan, just to, if I'm a pastor, I'm sitting in the church or a church leader or somebody there and say, look, Alpha's been around for years, like many, many, many years. We've run it in the past. We might have had some good experience. Maybe we've done it and we thought, that was fine, but it didn't really work for us, or it worked once and we're not sure it'll work again. What would you say to people who are thinking and processing that aspect of the whether they do or don't do Alpha?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing to note is, I've run Alphas and sometimes they haven't gone to my hopes and plans. But the question is, is this really about me or is this about our church? I just encourage you, try to realize that maybe there's some things that we can work on. So globally around the world, we know it works in all sorts of cultures, all sorts of situations. So I would actually start to address what actually didn't work. And that's what we can learn from each other on. Like, was it that no one came? Well, maybe we can address why didn't they come? Let's address the barriers that were there for people in our church that were meant to make invitations, but they didn't. Like, maybe there was some fear. Maybe there's something we could do to address it. Yep. Or maybe we have to reset the culture. Maybe there's a lack of awareness of the quality of content. And so that's it's really, if you dig down, and if you've used alpha and it wasn't the experience that you hoped for, you can dig down and just say, okay, let's look at this together, because we know it works around the world. We know, like last year, we had like 92,000 Australian participants, and we're already breaking that record this year. So we know it's effective. How do we make it effective to work for us in our own setting? So those are the questions to look at.
Okay.
And really, it kind of comes down to typically two questions: barriers of invitation in the church. People aren't inviting, so looking at and then addressing that. And the second is ensuring a great participant experience, so that people feel safe, loved, and cared for. How can we make sure they have a great time? So those are typically the two questions that it fundamentally comes down to.
Fantastic.
Address those, and you'll probably have a great result.
Fantastic, Ryan. I'm sure. If people need to, they'll reach out to you and get some assistance anyway. I'd like to thank you for coming. I know you're at a campsite. You're doing some ministry up there in Queensland. But I want to say to our listeners, whether it's Alpha or sharing your personal story or simply loving your neighbour through some practical sort of application of your faith, my prayer for our listeners is that you may personally know the love of Christ in your own life, and that experience be so positive for you that you want to share this good news with everyone else. May you find a way to do this that works for you. And until next week, may you experience the blessings of God.